Cole Hartley stood on the wooden platform of Ridgeview Station, with his hands buried in his coat pockets, trying to pretend the shaking was only from the cold. The depot was small, just a ticket window, a stove, and a lantern that swung in the wind, but tonight it felt like a judge waiting to pass sentence on his life. A train whistle cut through the December dark and his chest pulled tight. He thought of the newspaper ad he had written back in his cabin on a lonely night, asking for an honest, hard-working woman who would share a far-off homestead with him. On the page those words had seemed simple. Standing in the snow with his breath turning to white in the air, they felt like the biggest gamble he had ever made. The engine finally rolled into view, iron and steam and noise too big for this tiny station. The platform shook as the train ground to a stop. The conductor yanked the passenger door open and a wave of warmer air and coal smoke spilled out. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a small gloved hand caught the rail, and a young woman stepped down into the blowing snow. Her coat was too thin for Montana, and the hem of her dark blue dress was already damp. Snow clung to the edge of her bonnet, and to the dark lashes that framed her steady brown eyes. A worn carpetbag hung from one hand, and a scuffed trunk waited behind her. She looked smaller than he had pictured, but her shoulders were set like someone used to standing back up after being knocked down. Her name was Norah Keene, 23 years old, once of Philadelphia and endless factory hours. Cole knew that from the neat, careful letters she had sent across half a continent. She had written about machines that never stopped and foremen who never smiled, about the smoke that settled in her lungs and the noise that followed her into sleep, about a boarding house bed that never felt like it belonged to her. In his replies, Cole had told her the hard truth about this place: blizzards that could swallow a man, wolves that tested fences, long miles between neighbors, a cabin and a patch of land that were more promise than comfort, and a cowboy who was tired of talking only to his own echo. Now she stood in front of him, breath fogging in the sharp air, eyes moving over his face, and then over the empty stretch of land beyond the tracks. Cole took off his hat and made himself speak, giving his name in a voice that sounded rougher than it had in his head. Norah studied him like a woman used to weighing men quickly. Then she gave a short nod that said he matched the words he had sent. He picked up her trunk, heavier than it looked, and carried it to the wagon. When he came back and offered his hand, he felt strength in her grip, even through both sets of gloves. When she settled beside him on the narrow seat, the space between them felt full of all the things they had not yet said. He snapped the reins and the team pulled away from the depot light into open country. Harness metal jingled, wagon wheels creaked, and the last glow of town fell behind them. Cole pulled a folded wool blanket from under the seat and handed it to her. Norah thanked him and drew it over her legs without fuss or show. She turned toward the valley, watching the dark line of pines and the black shapes of the mountains, as if she was trying to fix them in her mind. For a while they rode in silence with only the wind and the horses for company. At last Norah spoke. She said the land was wider than she had imagined from his letters, that in the city the sky had always been chopped into narrow strips by roofs and smoke. Her voice carried both fear and quiet wonder. Cole told her the land out here could stretch a person or break them, and sometimes it did a bit of both. He kept his eyes on the frozen ruts, and told her winter could close the road without warning, turning a short walk into a real risk. Norah did not ask if they should turn back. Instead, she asked what needed doing first at the homestead, like someone already counting herself part of it. He answered in simple words: wood cut and stacked high. Water hauled and kept from freezing, animals fed and sheltered, a roof that held under weight. She listened, and nodded like she was already dividing the work in her head. After another mile, she asked why he had truly written for a wife. Not the polite reason, but the real one. Cole told her he was tired of eating in silence, and tired of feeling like a ghost inside his own life. Norah did not tease or look away. She just gave a small nod, the kind a person gives when they recognize their own kind of loneliness. If this story is touching your heart already, let me know in the comments where you are watching from and if you have ever gone through something similar. Also tell me what you would like me to improve in future stories. At last the cabin came into view, tucked against a low wall of rock that broke the worst of the wind. Smoke curled from the stovepipe into the grey sky. A small barn leaned beside it, with a short corral, where 3 horses and 2 milk cows stood, with their heads down against the cold. It was not a grand ranch, just rough boards and hard work and a start. Cole watched Norah's face, bracing himself for the look that said this was not what she had imagined, ready to turn the team back toward the station if that was what she asked. Instead, she let out a short, shaky laugh that seemed to surprise even her. For one quick heartbeat, her eyes filled with tears. She wiped them away with the back of her glove and said the place looked real. And that was what mattered. Real. Not fancy. The word landed deep in his chest. He had promised her a life he was still building. Now that promise stood in front of them, stubborn and small against the winter, and she was choosing to step into it. Inside, the cabin was warm and plain. The iron stove glowed and a pot of beans gave off a simple, honest smell. Cole showed her the water bucket and the wash basin, the narrow shelf with flour and coffee, the peg where she could hang her coat. He pointed to the bed at the back wall and told her she would sleep there, that he would take the cot by the stove. Norah moved through the room slowly, touching the table, the quilt, the window ledge, learning the feel of the place that was now hers as well as his. They ate their first meal in quiet, passing beans and rough bread between them at the small table. Outside, the wind picked up and tapped at the window, with loose bits of snow and ice. Somewhere out in the timber, a lone wolf called Tasha, long and low. The sound raised the hair along Cole's neck, not from fear alone, but from the old knowing that storms and hunger often traveled together. Norah set her spoon down and listened, eyes wide but steady, then said that city winters had been loud, but this one felt deeper, like the land itself was holding its breath. Norah moved closer to the fire, rubbing her hands, listening to the wind and the new quiet that lived between them. Cole sat on the edge of the cot and watched her silhouette against the stove light. He could feel the storm edging nearer with every gust against the logs. He had brought a stranger into his home on the eve of a Montana winter blow, and already she was part of every choice he made. As the night deepened and the wind rose, he understood that whatever came next, they would face it together in this small square of light carved out of the dark. By late afternoon, the light outside the cabin turned flat and grey. The wind that had been a steady push all day sharpened and rattled the window frame. Cole felt the change in his bones. Winter out here did not move gentle. It came like a fist. He checked the fire, checked the latch, and listened. Somewhere beyond the walls, the barn roof groaned under new snow. Norah sat at the table, mending a loose button on her coat. Her stitches were small and neat, the work of someone used to making things last. She looked up when a hard gust shook the cabin, and asked if it was turning bad. Cole told her the storm was settling in, and that they might not see town again for a good while. Then he crossed to the peg by the door, and took down a coil of thick rope. He laid the rope on the table and told her what it was for. One end stayed tied to the iron ring beside the door. The other ran straight to the barn so a person could find the way in a whiteout when sky and ground turned into one blind sheet. He put the rough fibre in her hands and told her that out there, this line might be the only solid thing. Norah wrapped it once around her glove and nodded. She understood there would be no room for panic when the world went white. Outside, the wind struck harder. A dull banging began somewhere in the dark, over and over. Cole knew it came from the barn. Waiting would only let something tear loose. He pulled on his coat and hat, wrapped his scarf, and cracked the door. The wind punched in, carrying fine snow that skated across the floor and died near the stove. He told Norah they had to go now, before the storm reached its full weight. He showed her how to stand behind him, one hand on his belt, the other on the rope. If she lost either, she was to stop and call out. Her face was pale in the firelight, but her eyes stayed steady. She wrapped a scarf around her mouth, pulled on her gloves, and stepped in close behind him. Outside, the world vanished in moving white. The hills, the trail, even the barn, just a short walk away disappeared. Cole gripped the rope and moved forward, one careful step at a time. Norah locked her fingers in his belt and on the line. Snow packed around their boots. Wind hit in bursts that tried to push them sideways. The rope burned against his glove, stiff with ice but solid. Fear rose sharp for the woman behind him, who had crossed half a country for this chance. At last his knuckles struck wood. The barn wall loomed out of the blur. He slid along it until his fingers found the frozen latch. It stuck. Cole hammered it with his fist until feeling left his fingers. Norah pressed her shoulder against his arm, adding her weight. The latch finally gave and they stumbled into the barn. The door slammed behind them and the roar of the storm dropped to a deep growl. Cole lit the lantern by the door. Yellow light spilled over stalls and rafters. Horses stamped and snorted, eyes wide. The cows shifted restlessly, breath rising in clouds. He walked the row, running his hands along their legs and ribs, checking for injury, talking to them in a low, steady voice that soothed him as much as them. Norah stayed at his shoulder, ready when he asked for a fork of hay or a fresh armful of straw. At the water trough, ice had skinned over the top. He handed her an iron bar and showed her where to strike. Norah set her jaw and swung until dark water showed, and the edge of the trough steamed in the lantern light. Then they checked the chickens, huddled together in their corner, and made sure the small door was tight. The banging that had started it all came from the north wall. Cole found a shutter slapping where a nail had pulled free. If he left it, the wind would peel it back and pour snow straight into the hay. He held the board and drove fresh nails while Norah braced the wood. Each hit was a small gain, in a fight the weather did not care about. The walk back to the cabin was worse. The wind had shifted and now cut straight across the rope line. Snow jammed into collars and sleeves, stealing heat from their skin. Cole kept one hand on the rope and the other on Norah's elbow when the ground dropped into hidden drifts. Twice he stopped and made her stamp her feet. He checked her cheeks for the pale, flat look of frostbite. They were red with cold and anger, but alive. At last the cabin door showed as a darker shape in the white. Cole shouldered it open and pushed Norah inside ahead of him. Heat rolled out to meet them. He dropped the latch and stamped snow from his boots. Norah went straight to the stove, holding her hands toward the iron, breathing hard. Her face was bright from the cold and from something fiercer. She said she had thought she knew winter. Cole told her that Montana winter taught a different kind of lesson. He hung their wet coats on the pegs and watched water drip. He filled the kettle and set it on. When the coffee was ready, he poured it into tin cups and slid one into her hands. She wrapped her fingers around the warm metal and drank in slow swallows. Outside, the wind circled the cabin like a living thing, hunting for any weakness. Inside, the stove roared and the small room felt like the center of the whole valley. The storm did not pass that night. It dug in and stayed. By the second evening they were deep in it. Snow had climbed past the window ledge. The rope line outside hummed under the pull of the wind. Cole watched it through the small pane, and knew the barn still needed its last check. He reached for his coat. Norah pushed herself up from the chair and said she would go too. Her boot caught the edge of the rug by the stove. She lurched, grabbed for the table, and her foot rolled sideways with a soft twist. She sucked in air and went still, face gone white. She did not scream, but her hand locked on the table as if it were the rope line again. Cole dropped to his knees. He eased her boot off and ran his fingers along the ankle. Heat and swelling met his touch. He wrapped the joint with clean cloth, then braced it with a thin board and cord. Norah watched him with her jaw tight. When she tried to stand, pain drove the strength from her legs. He caught her and set her back in the chair. Outside, the wind slammed hard against the wall. The lantern flickered. The barn still needed its night check, and the storm sounded hungry. Cole looked from the door to Norah's braced ankle and made his choice fast. He lifted her, carried her to the bed, and tucked quilts around her legs. He propped the injured foot on a folded blanket to keep it raised. He told her to stay off it and to keep the fire alive. Then he took up the lantern, wrapped his scarf, grabbed the rope with one gloved hand, and stepped alone back into the howling dark. The wind hit Cole hard when he stepped out with the lantern. Snow slapped his face, and the rope line tugged in his fist. For a second he saw the cabin light behind him, and Norah's thin face in the doorway. Then the door shut, and there was nothing but white, and the small circle of yellow ahead of him. He moved by feel. One hand slid along the frozen rope, his boots dragged through deep drifts. The wind shoved his chest and tried to turn him, but he kept going. At last his knuckles struck boards. The barn wall rose out of the blur and he leaned against it with a rough breath of thanks. Inside, the storm dropped to a dull roar. The horses stomped and tossed their heads. The cows shifted and blew steam into the cold air. Cole spoke to them low and steady. He broke ice from the trough, forked hay, and checked each latch with numb fingers. Every small job felt heavy, but each one meant they might all see another morning. Even while he worked, his mind stayed on Norah. She was alone in that small cabin with her ankles swelling under a quilt while the wind pushed at the logs. The animals needed him. So did she. He finished as fast as he dared, checked the doors one more time, then turned back into the storm. The walk home felt longer. The rope was stiff as iron. Snow packed into his collar and cuffs and stole the heat from his skin. Still he moved, one slow pull at a time, until the cabin door showed as a dark square in the white. He shoved it open and stumbled inside. Heat rolled over him. He dropped the latch and stood there while his eyes adjusted. Norah sat in the chair by the stove, ankle propped on a folded blanket, hands wrapped around a tin cup. The fire burned high. A kettle steamed on the back of the stove. From the look on her face, she had not taken her eyes off that door since he left. He told her the barn was holding and the animals were fine. She let out a long breath and nodded. Then she asked if he was hurt. His fingers burned as feeling crawled back into them. He said he was only cold and tired. She passed him the extra cup she had kept ready and watched until some of the tightness left his shoulders. The storm did not pass that night. Or the next. Day and night slid into each other in a small circle of light and work. Cole made the rope walk to the barn morning and evening. Norah kept the fire alive, melted snow, and learned the cabin. She sorted their food without wasting a crumb, and turned beans and flour into plain, filling meals. The ankle slowed her but did not stop her. When she moved wrong, pain flashed across her face. Cole tried to take on more, but she pushed back. She said she had spent too many years in a city where life moved past her. She was not going to sit useless while this place fought to stand. Her words were plain, but they cut deeper than any speech. On the second night, after another hard trip to the barn, Cole stood by the narrow cot he had been using by the stove. His hands shook as he spread the thin blanket. The bed at the back wall was wide enough for two tired people who knew how to keep respect between them. Norah watched him and finally said it. She told him it made no sense for him to freeze on the floor while she took all the quilts. They could roll one quilt and lay it down the middle if that helped. Cole began to argue, but another gust slammed the cabin and rattled the window frame. Every muscle in his back ached from rope and cold. Pride was a small thing beside that. He nodded once. He laid the rolled quilt between them and lay down on his side, back stiff, hands folded on his chest. Norah settled on her side, facing the wall. The storm brushed the roof. The stove snapped and settled. Their breathing filled the space between those sounds. For the first time in a long time, Cole did not feel like the only living soul in the dark. Sometime deep in the night, Norah spoke his name. Cole answered, his voice softer than he meant. She asked him why he had really written that ad. Not the neat reasons in his first letter. The ones he kept back. He stared into the dark and let himself answer. He said he had been lonely in a way that made him feel ashamed. He could fix a fence, break a horse, ride for days in bad weather, but he could not build real warmth out of empty rooms. He said he had started to feel like he was fading around the edges, like a ghost in his own house. Norah was quiet for a moment. Then she told him the city had been loud but sharp, with its own kind of empty. She said it was worse to feel unseen in a crowd than it was to stand alone under a clear sky. Out here, she said, the land never promised to love you, at least it was honest about what it might take. Her words settled over him like an extra blanket. The storm still scraped at the logs, but it no longer felt like it was pressing on his chest alone. Two people lay there now, awake and honest in the dark. Both of them knew they had crossed miles and hard years to reach this one narrow bed. The storm did not break on the third day. Snow climbed higher against the walls until it reached the bottom of the window. Cole dug the door out again and again. Each time the drift was deeper. His hands cracked at the knuckles from wet and cold. Norah's ankle turned dark and tight at the bone, but she still made her slow way to the stove. She kept the fire alive so he would come back to light and not to cold black. On the fourth morning, Cole woke to a different kind of stillness. No howl, no slam of wind. Only the tick of the stove, and the soft creak of wood letting go of strain. He went to the window and pushed the shutter open. Sunlight hit his face so bright it made his eyes water. The world outside lay still under heavy snow. Drifts rose higher than the fence posts. The barn roof sagged under the weight, but still stood. The sky was a hard, clear blue that only came after weather tried to break a place and failed. Behind him, Norah watched his shoulders. He turned and told her the storm had finally moved on. Then he set coffee on the stove and pulled on his outer coat and boots. Somewhere out in that quiet white were the cattle that meant the difference between getting through winter or not. Norah tried to swing her legs over the side of the bed. Pain took her breath and pushed her back. He told her she was staying inside, that her work was the fire and the light, and staying warm until he came home. She started to argue, then saw the fear plain on his face and stopped. Instead, she asked him to be careful. Cole stepped close, bent, and pressed his lips to her forehead, quick and sure. Then he picked up his rifle, opened the door to the bright cold, and walked out toward whatever waited beyond the barn. Cole rode out past the barn with his rifle across his saddle, following the dark cut of the creek through the white valley. The sky was clear for the first time in days, and the air burned his lungs. When he found the herd, the cattle were bunched tight near a strip of low trees, ribs sharp under rough coats, eyes dull. A few lay still in the snow, and did not rise at all. He moved among them, counting heads, and felt his stomach sink at what the storm had taken. There was no room for anger. He broke a path toward better shelter, chipped ice so the living could drink, and pushed them forward step by slow step. He was turning back toward the cabin when a long, thin howl tore across the bright air. Another answered from the tree line. Cole stopped and saw grey shapes sliding between bare trunks, low and steady, eyes fixed on the weakest cattle. His horse shifted under him, catching their scent. Cole knew he could ride hard for the cabin and reach safety. He also knew the pack would fall on the herd the moment he left. These cattle were not just his winter now. They were Norah's too. He nudged his horse into the open snow between the herd and the wolves, and raised his rifle. One warning shot slapped into the drift near the lead wolf, throwing up ice. The animal flinched, then edged sideways, trying to circle. The rest of the pack spread into a rough half-ring, testing him. His horse danced, wanting to bolt, and Cole talked to the animal under his breath, keeping the barrel moving from one grey shape to another. Behind him, the cabin door banged open. He heard the scrape of a bad step and Norah's voice calling that she had his spare rifle and the porch corner covered. He turned long enough to see her wrapped in his coat, braced on one leg, pale but steady, leaning on the rail with the barrel lined out over the snow. She should have been in bed with a foot raised. Instead, she had dragged herself outside and into the fight. He told her to stay there, to watch the right corner, to fire only if a wolf broke past him. She gave one tight nod and settled the rifle against her shoulder. The pack rushed in twos, darting and testing. Cole fired close, driving them back, refusing to let them split the cattle. Then a young wolf broke wide and sprinted toward the open side near the cabin. Cole turned his horse, but deep snow grabbed at the animal's legs and slowed him. Norah shifted her weight, swallowed a groan, and steadied the long gun along the rail, She drew a breath and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the valley. The young wolf yelped and spun away, limping back toward the trees. The rest of the pack hesitated, watched Cole wheel his horse with the rifle ready again, and finally began to slip back into the timber one by one. Silence settled in their place, sharp and thin. Cole turned just in time to see Norah sag against the rail. He was off his horse and up the steps in a few long strides, catching her as her bad leg gave out. He carried her inside like she weighed nothing, heart pounding harder now than it had out there among the wolves. In the warm cabin he set her on the bed and eased her boot and wrapping away. The ankle was swollen and dark, the skin stretched tight. Norah tried to brush it off with a crooked smile, saying she had never been much good at staying put, but her voice broke on the last word. Cole cooled clean cloth in melted snow and laid it carefully around the joint. He wrapped it again with steady hands that shook anyway, then sat on the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees, listening to the stove crackle. Norah reached out and rested her fingers on his rough knuckles, light but sure. That small touch broke something open in him. He told her, in a low voice, that she had scared him more than the wolves did, because he cared about her more than he had planned, more than he thought he was allowed to. The fear he had felt out there had not just been for the herd and the horse, it had been for her. Norah's eyes filled, but she did not look away. She said she cared for him too, more than she meant to when she stepped off that train with one worn carpet bag and nowhere else to go. She said that as hard as this winter had been, this small cabin already felt more like home than any city room she had rented by the week. Then, with a small, brave smile, she asked if he would kiss her. He bent toward her and did. The kiss was careful at first, then sure and warm, full of all the things they had tried to fit into letters, and could not. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, and let out a long breath that felt like the last piece of the storm leaving his chest. The next morning he checked the calendar tacked behind the shelf. Christmas Eve. Outside, the sky stayed bright and hard blue, and the valley lay still under deep snow. Norah's ankle throbbed less, but it still kept her mostly to the bed and the chair. Cole cut pine boughs and brought them inside. Their sharp green scent filled the room as Norah guided where to hang them, so the rough walls looked less like a bare shelter and more like a home. After supper he went to the small wooden box he had carved from scrapboards and set it in her lap. Inside lay the deed to the homestead with her name written beside his. He told her he had filed it that way before she ever stepped off the train, because from the first letter he had meant for the land to belong to both of them. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She said she wanted him to ask her plain, not from duty or fear of being alone, but as a man asking a woman to choose him. So Cole went down on one knee on the packed earth floor. In the light of the stove and a single candle, he told her that what had started as ink on paper had become the one life he wanted. He asked her to marry him not for help or company alone, but because he did not want to face another season without her hand in his. Norah laughed through her tears and said yes in a way that left no doubt. They were married the next morning at the nearest neighbor's place, with snow shining under a clear sky and wood smoke rising straight up. The words were short and simple. The room was plain. But when they rode home, her ankle wrapped and his arm around her, the world felt steadier than it had before. Winter did not suddenly turn gentle. There were more storms and long nights and thin meals. They said goodbye to the big horse that had carried Cole through so many hard miles, and buried him on a hill that caught the first light. Spring came slow and muddy. Snow pulled back from the fence posts. Grass crept along the creek. Calves staggered to their feet in shaky sunlight. Norah bent over a small garden with cold hands and fierce hope, pressing seeds into the thawed ground. Cole finished the barn roof and started framing an extra room on the cabin. Bit by bit, the place around them changed from a handful of boards in a wild valley into something that looked like a life being built on purpose. That night, as they lay in the bed they now fully shared, a faint howl drifted down from the hills. Cole heard it and felt the old tightness rise, then ease. Danger and hard weather would always live out there, but now, when he reached for the future, his hand closed around hers. He rose at dawn, poured coffee for two, and stepped out into the cool air of another beginning, knowing that the wish that once sent a letter down a long line of rail had not been answered by luck alone. It had been answered by two people who chose honesty, chose the work, and chose to stay when the wind howled hardest. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more emotional Wild West stories that will touch your soul.